Hello, this is Clay Blackwood, your host for today's story. I would like to apologize for taking quite a while to upload. I have decided that from now on I shall post original stories written by me. So, make yourself comfortable, make sure to like and subscribe, and without further ado, let's begin. The Witch and the Beast. It was a time of mayhem, kings falling from their thrones like flies, revolution after revolution. One king arose and swore to end the conflict. He swore to bring upon the destruction of the Dark Forest. It was the time of the Victorian reign in a land not so far from the British Empire. The land was named Ilos after King Ilosius, the first man who set foot upon the land. The problem is, there were things in Ilos eons before the king had discovered it. The newcomers took it upon themselves to hunt down and kill the beings that resided there. For a millennium, those creatures lived in harmony, not to be bothered. The king and his men committed all kind of atrocious genocide. For years, the beings fought back, until the day where a powerful witch who lived there found a solution. She cursed the forest with the darkest of spells. She condemned all mortals who set foot into the dark forest with lunacy. The forest was in the middle of the land, separating the north from the south. The position of the forest forced the mortals to travel by sea in order to reach the other end of the land. This cost them incredible expenses alongside months of travel. The new king swore to take down the forest and pave the way between the north and the south. The forest was unknown to the humans, for no man who ever set foot in it lived to tell the tale. In it lived a beast. The beast resided in the eastern side of the forest, never to be bothered, not even by the creatures living there. The beast was a vampire. He was one of the first sentient beings who ever set foot onto the land. His name was Clay Blackwood. He lived in a vast black castle. He lived alone, with few occasional crows flying by his chimney. He sat on his balcony, sipping on a cup of fresh blood. He wore a black robe and even darker shoes. His hair was long, reaching over his shoulders. His eyes were bright red. The only whiteness to be seen was of his pale skin. He was a tall, well-built individual that looked nothing like the beast he was labeled to be. Once a week, he would leave the forest in the darkest of nights and head to the nearest village. In the village, he would stalk and slay a peasant and feed upon him. The word spread in the village that the beast was killing them, and the mobs began to gather and plot a trap. Clay stood on his balcony, listening to the sounds of the wind, enjoying the brightness of the moon. He was 1800 years old. He first landed on Ilos more than 1,000 years ago. He was fleeing from a vampire hunters that chased him all throughout Europe. When King Ilosius arrived, Clay saw that as an opportunity. It meant more blood for him. What he did not expect was for the men to hunt down all that was not one of them. He witnessed mass murderings of the Fae. He saw mortals raping witches. When the witch Lilith made the dark forest as refuge for the magical beings, he claimed the eastern part as his realm. The other creatures never approached him, for vampires were an abomination. They were made from the darkest forms of magic. Clay was famous for his ruthlessness. He was known to be a cold-blooded murderer, but deep down, he was just a kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. 1800 years ago, Clay was 18 years old. He was a pocket picker in the busy streets of Paris. He was not born there. He never knew where he was from. Paris was the only home he knew. He stole rings, necklaces, bracelets, and all the shiny things his wide blue eyes could spot. One night, in the coldness of the rain, he stole a jacket from a man buying some goods. He wore the jacket the next night and walked as if nothing has happened. The odds of him meeting the man were insanely slim, but he was never the luckiest. Clay felt a massive hand catching him by the neck and dragging him to a dark corner. The man slammed Clay into a wall with one hand, and with the other he began to undress him. The man wanted payment for the theft, but it was not money. Poor skinny Clay was powerless against the beast holding him. He fought with every ounce of might he had, and in a moment the man vanished from sight. Clay turned to see this woman devouring the man. She had sunk her teeth deep into his throat and until his head came off. After what seemed to be a delicious meal, she stood up, turned to Clay, and commented on how skinny and pale he looked. She said that he was closer to death than she was. Clay stood there with a shock in his face, trying to understand what was happening. He was about to get raped, and now he was saved by a blood-sucking woman. The woman proposed a job offer for the young boy, which he had no choice but to accept. One, he wanted to pay back the lady who saved him, and he wanted to know more about the power she possessed. Clay followed her to a nearby house. The woman gave him a cup of blood drawn from her wrist. She said that upon drinking the blood, he would gain the might of 1,000 men, the speed of a fallen angel, the sight of an oracle in the dark. The only price was, he will forever be a slave to both darkness and to her. Clay was a slave before, a slave of hunger, bullying, assaults, and all kinds of atrocities. The blood was an escape, and therefore with no hesitation he proceeded to drink it. The woman stood up and broke his neck. Clay, hours later, woke up dizzy. He wondered why she did that. She then handed him a woman, and all Clay could see was the blue vein on her neck, and how delicious it appeared. With a swift move, Clay sank his teeth in her neck and drank until her head fell off. The woman showed appreciation and said that Clay was a ripper like her. He was one of the deadliest types of vampires, those who finish drinking only when their victim is decapitated. The woman stared into the window in confusion, and in the midst of the silence that surrounded the room, dozens of wooden stakes came flying into the room. One of them hit the woman in the heart, and she immediately dropped dead. Clay, with confusion, ran out of the back door. He boarded the first ship he found and took off into the unknown. The ship hit the land months after its departure. It landed on what is now called the land of Ilos, and from the ship, one man emerged, and his name was Clay. He was no longer skinny, nor was he short. He had devoured the entire crew and was hungry for even more. Clay slayed many of the Fae and many of the witches. He only did so because his hunger forced him. The mortals, however, did it for pure pleasure. The beings in the forest knew Clay and how strong he was. Neither of them decided or dared to approach the eastern side. Clay ceased to hunt down the creatures of the land and made the humans his sole source of nurture. On the western side, numerous beings resided. Among them was a descendant of Lilith, the legend who made the forest, and her name was Gremory. Gremory was a powerful mage. She was the ruler of the West. All the creatures listened to her, for she had the wisdom of her ancestors. She had been a queen for 9 years. The 19-year-old girl was one of the loveliest godly creation that had ever walked the earth. Her hair was darker than the night. Her eyes were browner than honey, and her lips were pinker than the roses of the land. She lived in a dark small house, and the inside of the house was made of fine wood. She had a library as tall as an oak tree, filled with thousands of witchcraft books, and the rooms of the house were lit by black and red candles. She kept collections of skulls of the fallen mortals right next to her collections of scorpions. Gremory was a magnificent being, the wisest of them all. When Gremory spoke, the creatures listened. They obeyed her command, for she knew what was best for them. Gremory had 2 familiars, a black cat and a black raven. The raven was her eyes in the sky. He was back after a long day with the worst news. The new king has gathered an army in the south, and they were marching towards the forest. The issue was, the spell could only work on a handful of people at a time. An army of 100,000 men was more than enough to bring upon the destruction of all what her ancestor Lilith has built. Gremory began to spread the word amongst the people living there. She gathered witches and wizards, fairies and unicorns, centaurs, and all the beings that lived in the forest. They all prepared for war, but they were no match for the horde of men marching towards them. A battle like that would be nothing more than suicide. Gremory then had an idea, a weapon that no being would like. She said that their only hope was the beast in the east, and the creatures gasped in shock, and confusion dominated the air around them. They all declared that the being is not to be trusted, and that for years before the men arrived, he was the main enemy. Gremory acknowledged their concerns, but with all their might and their spells, an army of 100,000 men was unstoppable. A beast as merciless as him was all they needed. The beings disagreed, and although neither of them has any battle experience, they were confident in their skills. Gremory spoke her final words. She said that she herself despised the idea of a vampires fighting on her side, but desperate times call for desperate measures. The creatures fighting alone meant the destruction of the forest and the end of more than 1,000 years of peace. She then embarked on a journey to the east of the forest to speak to the so-called beast. She took only her familiars. After crossing the borders between the two sides, the east and the west, she felt the intensity of the atmosphere. She could sense the amount of malevolence coming from the beast. On the other side, Clay heard her steps on the dry leaves. He knew that he would have soon a visitor, so he cooked her a meal worthy of a queen. Clay never had a company for a millennium, apart from the occasional parties he would attend in the villages nearby. For years, he honed his vampiric skills and trained every day. He could hear and see for miles. He could lift tons of weight like it was nothing. And hours later, the bell of his massive castle rang, and the echo of the rusty bell was heard across the entire forest. The large door opened up by itself, and the moment Gremory set foot into the castle, hundreds of candles were lit. In the middle of the room was a fancy dinner table with a roasted deer in the middle. The beast came walking down the stairs, and both the beings stared into the windows of the souls of each other. Clay was amazed by her beauty, and the witch was fascinated by his looks as well. Clay asked her to sit down, and he did the same. He then declared that he had heard the sound of the marching men. The witch stated that she was there because she wanted him to be an ally and joined forces with her. She then proceeded to say that the men sought to destroy the entire forest, and his castle shan't be spared. The vampire drifted away from the conversation and began to ask the witch about things that piqued her interest. For years, neither of them have ever had such a deep conversation, and for a moment, it was as if they overcame their differences. Gremory then remembered the reason why she was there and tackled the subject again. She asked Clay for his assistance, to which he declined. He stated that the lives of the magical creatures meant nothing to him. The witch shut him up with an offer she knew he couldn't refuse. For 1,800 years, Clay was a slave of the dark, and Gremory offered him the one thing he desired the most, a daylight ring. The ring would allow him to walk in the sun. Clay was amazed and astonished with the offer, and he did not hesitate to agree. He swore to bring upon the destruction of her rivals in exchange for the ring. The two beings departed to meet the other creatures in a location agreed upon, and on the road, Clay acknowledged Gremory's beauty, and she did the same. Vampires and witches are solar opposites. They are beings who despised one another. This duo seemed to break that stereotype and worked miraculously well. Melkor, the witch's cat, noticed the dynamism between the two, so he hopped a little faster and let them converse. Clay and Gremory talked for hours and barely felt the time until they spotted the camp. In the camp, all the beings gathered waiting for Gremory's orders, and when they saw Clay, their faces turned pale. When he took one step forward, they took one step back, fearing him. Clay declared that he meant them no harm. He was there as an ally, and the creatures kept their guards up as Gremory began to state the plan. A few hours later, Clay heard the troops on the edge of the forest, and all the beings held their positions and waited Gremory's signal. The king pushed a dozen of prisoners into the forest, first to test out the effect of the spell. The men lost their wits, but two of them didn't. The king realized that the spell only worked on a couple of people at a time. He found the truth. So he ordered his men to charge into the forest. The trees, however, had another say. They arose from their slumber and began to throw men left and right. The mortars, archers, set the living trees into fire and marched deeper into the forest. The forest was dark on the inside, with no creature to be seen or heard. When most of the army was deep within the forest, Gremory launched a flare. She signaled the beings, and they emerged from their hideout and charged towards the mortals. All that could be seen was blood, both sides gruesomely slaughtering each other. The beings fought as hard as they could, but alone they were not enough. The witches cast their spells left and right. They cursed the men with all kinds of plagues. They transformed some of them into animals. They reduced others into dusts. The centaurs took care of the cavalry. Their large swords chopped off the heads of the knight. Their hoofs crushed out the fallen men, and the fae and the fairies took care of the air. They flew on the top of the army and threw fireballs on them. The mortars' screams were heard all across the forest. Gremory held her ground and took down as many men as she could. One large knight knocked her into the ground, and his sword was about to be placed into her heart. The man dropped, and Gremory saw Clay standing behind him. Clay devoured scores of men. Neither stood a chance against the speed of a falling star. The men were surrounded from all sides. Those who attempted to slip the ranks and flee were met by a set of fangs sucking on their blood. The men were terrified of the dark forest inhabitants' tactics. The king was on his horse, ordering the men to fight harder. A large sword chopped off his horse into two, and Clay saw the king on the ground and finished the job. The battle lasted for hours, and tens of thousands of men fell. The creatures, however, lost only a handful of soldiers. The mortals, knowing they had no chance in victory, retreated, and upon their escape, a wooden stake was embedded into the heart of the beast. A vampire hunter had found Clay, and Gremory saw this and drove her sword into the man's chest. Clay fell into her arms, and all he could see was her honey-brown eyes. For thousands of years he felt nothing, yet in the arms of a witch his dead heart moved an inch. No moment of his long life could match the warm hands of the lovely Gremory. A centaur helped her to take him somewhere safe. Clay fulfilled his promise now. It was her turn. She rushed and brought her oldest spellbook. There was a chapter in it dedicated to the creation of vampires, and in the book was a section on how to heal a staked heart. It took Gremory immense amount of strength to perform a spell. After she had finished, Clay was not moving, and all the beings looked at her, crying for the first time. She had grown attached to the beast. She has never loved a man, but this was not like the others. He was the only one that understood her, the one she could speak to freely, the one that liked her for who she was, and the one who viewed how lovely of a creature she was. Gremory's eyes let loose a tear that fell directly into the lips of Clay, and Clay smiled for the first time in eons and wondered how can a lovely being cry for the monster he was. Gremory saw that Clay was alive, and she gave him the strongest hug she had ever given. Clay did the same. The fallen creatures rose again with the help of witchcraft, and Gremory fulfilled her promise and gave the beast a daylight ring. The next day, Clay tested the ring, and for the very first time in 1800 years, he could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin. Clay turned and looked at the witch. She wore a black dress that showed the whiteness of her skin. Clay could only focus on the red lips of hers, and he turned to face her. Even though the height difference between them was enormous, he held her between his hands and stared into her soul. The two leaned against each other and shared a lovely, gentle kiss. The little girl was running in the green grass when she stumbled upon a black rose. She took it to her father, knowing he adored the color black. Clay looked at the rose with amazement and thanked his little daughter. The girl's name was Hope, for she was the hope the magical creatures had been wishing for. Gremory came into the room covered in feathers. One of her spells didn't work. The three of them laughed about it, and the little Hope looked into the eyes of her parents and asked the question, "Mommy, Daddy, how did you two meet?" Clay's red eyes met Gremory's brown ones, and they both smiled. Clay took his daughter into the porch of the black castle that now had a view on the entire land. He looked at it and told his daughter that 10 years ago, this land was a forest. The forest was home of many creatures living in harmony. Outside the forest were dangerous monsters. They wanted to harm them. Mommy and Daddy had to work together and slay all the beasts and banish them forever. We then claimed back the land, and you, Hope, are half witch, half vampire. You will carry on the legacy of both of us. Hope looked into her father with concern and asked if the monsters will ever return. Clay sighed and said if they ever do, we shall be ready. Hope went back to bed, and Clay and Gremory both sat in the room's balcony and gazed into the stars, the two beings forming a bond stronger than steel. Gremory leaned into Clay's chest and fell asleep. The witch and the beast lived happily ever after, and they still do. The end. Thank you all for listening to this story, and if you like it, make sure to like and subscribe. This is Clay Blackwood, signing off.